Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 66, God's Faithful Works. We start with the superscription for the choir director, a song, and then it's also called a psalm, just trying to get our definitions in then. And now the psalm itself begins, shout joyfully to God, all the earth, sing the glory of his name, make his praise glorious. Notice the shout, the sing, the reference to praise. This is going to be a psalm that is praising the Lord, or rather, notice it's calling you to praise the Lord, and then it's going to give you some things about which you can praise him for. Verse 3, say to God, how awesome are your works. Now, we've said this actually recently with some of the other psalms that we've been in. This term also, uh, nu ra is the nifel participle of yara, or yare is uh, to fear, and it's the basic word for fear. But we sometimes, depending on the context, render it awe, or in this case, how awesome are your works? How fearful are your works? I guess you could say, depending on how you want to take this, how terrible are your works? Not that God is terrible, not that God is bad, but He's really big. He's got the power to just throw galaxies into existence, and galaxies are unimaginably big. And he's so much bigger than that. And that's the point. We have a God who is very big. And I like the way C.S. Lewis in his Chronicles of Narnia uh, pictures, in his case, Jesus as a lion. And he says, and he's not a tame lion. Well, let me just say, God is not tame. You cannot tame him, but he's good. And I'm borrowing that phrase from C.S. Lewis. Well, here, say to God, how awesome are your works? And notice we've titled this the works of God. How awesome are your works? Because of the greatness of your power, your enemies will give feigned obedience to you. Now, that's been rendered a few different ways. I think all the same general idea, except feigned obedience sounds like I'm just going to trick you. I'm going to pretend to obey when I'm not really. And I'm not sure that the pretense part is exactly right. Um, the King James Version rendered it, thine enemies submit themselves unto thee, just the submission part. Notice a feigned obedience is still an obedience, is still a submission. Um, but but the idea here, I think, is that yes, they are submitting, but not because they wanted to, because after all, they're described as enemies. So I think the King James is relying on the context to get that across. You have the ESV and the NIV, the New International Version, both saying, and I'm quoting here the ESV instead of the NIV, but they're both pretty close. Your enemies come cringing to you, and a number of translations render it that cringing idea. The Tanakh, this is the Jewish publication, renders it your enemies cower before your great strength, and I think all three of those, like a combination of, gets the idea across. They are enemies of God, but even enemies have to bow down because every knee will bow down and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. Actually, when Paul quotes that from Philippians, he's quoting the Old Testament, which I think it's in Isaiah that's talked about how uh, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that you are Lord, and speaking about God. Well, verse 4, all the earth will worship you. By the way, I think that's maybe telling you who the enemies are. The enemies are all the earth. You mean all the people on earth who are enemies of God? No, I think it's maybe bigger than that. Remember what Paul says in Romans chapter 3, that they've all gone out of the way. There's none who does righteous. There's not even one. That left to ourselves, we are all enemies, and yet we will all worship, whether we're on God's side, whether it's forced, whether it's feigned, whether it's cringing or not. And so all the earth will worship you and will sing praises to you. They will sing praises to your name. Selah, just stop and think and chew on that for a second. Verse 5, come and see, here it is again, the works of God, who is awesome in his deeds. Notice what we have is two different ways of describing. In English, we're going works and then deeds. Um, the Hebrew is doing the same thing. It takes two different words that mean essentially the same thing. Works and deeds are really the same thing. It's just two ways of describing it. And that's what you do in this sort of synonymous parallelism. You say it and then you say it again with different words, except the second time through, sometimes you expand on it a bit. That's pretty commonplace too. So come and see the works of God, who is awesome in his deeds toward the sons of men. It's not just works that we can see, it's the works that we can see. The ones that are not just in our eyesight, but also that are toward us in his dealings with us. Verse 6, and now he's going to describe some of those dealings, some of those deeds toward the sons of men. And you remember these stories from the Old Testament. Verse 6, he turned the sea into dry land. They passed through the river on foot. Now, is that just another description of what happened in Exodus with the Red Sea, or is this looking forward a bit to the days of Joshua, where the waters of the Jordan River were stopped? Maybe a little bit of both. Don't know that I would necessarily confine it to that second line just to one of those. There, let us rejoice in him. He rules by his might forever. His eyes keep watch on the nations. Let not the rebellious exalt themselves. God is really big, and sometimes his bigness, in the past at least, and I think in the present too, have jumped right into where we live now, into history. It's not just that God created the universe and he went off on vacation, but no, he has acted upon and with and sometimes even against his creation when they were against him. Not He didn't do it arbitrarily, but because of sinful rebellion, and that was the story in the Exodus. um, he has gotten involved in history. He is a God who acts in history. Verse 8, bless our God, O peoples, and sound his praise abroad, who keeps us in life. Notice that's what he does do. And then the next line tells us what he doesn't do, and does not allow our feet to slip. And so bless him. This is the psalm that's calling us to worship the Lord, to bless him. By blessing, I mean speak of him in a great way. Another word for that would be worship. To bless him and sound his praise, and to tell everybody we know about the great God that we worship, the great God who is there. Now, verses 1 through 9 that we've looked at so far, the psalmist has been speaking about God. As we come to the next verse, that's going to change for a few verses. From verses 10 through 15, the psalmist is going to speak to God. So let's jump in. Verse 10, for you have tried us, O God. Notice, you've tried us. You have refined us as silver is refined. How do you refine silver? You heat it. And sometimes God's people, uh, God's peoples get heated. And sometimes they get burned up a bit. Notice, you have brought us into the net. You laid an impressive burden upon our loins. You just, uh, uh, by the way, that is a figure of speech, but it's a graphic figure of speech. I mean, I'm wondering if I had to say this, but I'm going to. You gave us a good kick in the nether regions. Okay, I'm saying it as politely as I can, and I think that's the idea there. Verse 12, you made men ride over our heads. We went through the fire and through water, yet you brought us out into a place of abundance. And so you did some bad things against the bad people, and you brought us through the fire. I'm an old retired firefighter, if you don't know that. I spent 30 years doing that job while I was teaching Bible. I don't do that anymore. I'm much too old for that sort of thing. But going through fire and water is something, yes, I've done that literally. I'm not sure this is necessarily literal, except I think of the Israelites. They literally went through fire and water. There's no figurative about that. The waters of the Red Sea, and think about the pillar of fire. And you brought us out of that place, out of the wilderness, into a place of abundance. He continues, verse 13, I shall come into your house with burnt offering. Notice the reference to the house. Now we're talking temple language. Now we're talking a place of worship. I shall pay you my vows. Again, this is temple language, which my lips have uttered and my mouth spoke when I was in distress. So notice the parallelism still continuing there. Verse 15, I shall offer to you burnt offerings of fat beasts. That is the things that you do in a temple with the smoke of ram. So you've got the fat beasts, you've got the smoke of rams. I shall make an offering of bulls with male goats. All of these things are things that take place in the temple. And the point is that the worship that is being given to God is because of the great things he has done. The great things he has done to the enemies of the psalmist and the great things that he has done on behalf of the psalmist. Now we continue in verse 16. We already saw where the psalmist speaks about God, verses 1 through 9. We saw him speaking to God, and now we're going to see him again in the rest of the psalm, where he's going to be speaking again about God. Come and hear, all who fear God. So he's calling for an assembly. Notice those who fear God. Well, in a sense, that's everybody should fear God. But I think more precisely here, when it's talking about those who fear God in a positive sense. And so come in here, and I will tell what he has done for my soul. I cried to him with my mouth, and he was extolled. Notice with my mouth, and then with my tongue he was extolled. So again, don't miss the parallelism. So come in here. I'm going to tell you. I called out to him when I needed him, and I called him with my tongue. Verse 18, if I regard wickedness in my heart, the Lord will not hear. It's almost like this briefly turns into, it's been a call to look at God's works, but there's a little segment that reminds me of a wisdom psalm, where just for a moment, you need to learn something about worship. And notice, if I regard wickedness in my heart, the Lord will not hear. It's not that God gets hard of hearing, but he's not going to necessarily respond. That God looks upon the heart of the prayer. Now, notice this is followed immediately by a but of contrast, but certainly God has heard. Now, notice if I regard wickedness in my heart, the Lord will not hear, but God has heard. I like a certain certainty in there. He has given heed to the voice of my prayer, and that's a good thing. Now, does that mean that the psalmist never regarded wickedness in his heart? Well, bear with me for a minute. But if I do, he won't hear, but God has heard. He's given heed to the voice of my prayer. Blessed be God. This is all about a blessing and to speak highly of God, who has not turned away my prayer, nor his loving kindness from me. Now, I said, if I regard wickedness in my heart, the Lord won't hear. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, there have been times where I regarded wickedness in my heart. So what's that all about? Does that mean God's not going to hear me? Well, I think that's what the cross is all about. The cross is all about because you have, let me just say you have regarded wickedness in your heart. If you're a human being, not because you're human, but because you're a sinner, you have done that. And the cross is all about the Son of God coming and being sent to come and die in our place. Because we have not only regarded in our heart, we've actually done wickedness. We've all sinned and fall short. Notice when we quote that from Romans chapter 6, we have all sinned and fall short. The sinned is in the past tense, the aorist, and fall short is in the present tense. Is it just past or is it present? The answer is yes. But the good news is he has come to change our heart. He took our penalty, the penalty we deserved, but he doesn't stop there. Then he moves within us to create in us, I'm going to borrow the language of the Psalms here, to create in us a new heart, to imbibe within us a new spirit, so that we might be different, so that we no longer will regard wickedness in our hearts. By the way, I'm still under construction. And if you're hearing this, you are too. We're not there yet. But we are in that process, declared righteous because of the very righteousness of Christ credited to us, but also being made righteous. We call that sanctification, which is a process that he begins when we are reborn into him and continues until the day we finally see him and are completed in him.